Some will criticize us on the cost of action. They'll point to the size of our deficit in 2021. It's a testament of the shock that COVID-19 had on our economy. But our government knew that the cost of inaction would have been far greater. Those who would have us do less ignore that without government action, millions of jobs would have been lost, putting the burden of debt onto families and jeopardizing Canada's resilience. At a time when Canadian workers and families are facing significant hardship, austerity and tightening your belt is not the answer.
Welcome back to Power and Politics. We are covering the government's fiscal snapshot from all corners tonight. That snapshot shows the federal deficit is projected to hit now $343 billion this year, a level not seen since the Second World War. And Canada's GDP is also projected to shrink by 6.8% this year. That's the economy shrinking, the worst since the Great Depression. We just got reaction to the snapshot from NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. Let's now bring in Andrew Scheer. He's the leader of the Conservative Party. He also joins us from Ottawa, I believe. Hi, Mr. Scheer. Good to see you again.
Thank you very much, Vashti. Good to see you too.
I listened to your speech today in the House of Commons in response to this snapshot, and much of it echoed what you have said in the past in your critique of the size of the deficit and the debt, both, of course, which have grown substantially during this pandemic. I had someone tweet at me today in response to some of those numbers. They are, quote, worth every cent. Lives are being helped and saved. Given the needs of Canadians and their businesses during this pandemic, didn't the government do the right thing by taking on extra debt?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember a few things. Under this Liberal government, there were almost $30 billion worth of deficits before the pandemic even hit. So that left Canada in a weakened and vulnerable position. What Conservatives have been saying from day one is we agreed that we needed to get help out the door quickly to Canadians. We wanted the government to fix the programs that they had. And what Bill Morneau is trying to do is create a false choice between what they did and nothing. Conservatives were advocating for a better CERB program that removes the penalty for working. We were looking for a more flexible wage subsidy that would cover more workers and more businesses. So this government has made major blunders that left Canada in a weakened position. And what Conservatives are saying now is we need a plan for the recovery. There's nothing in there today that illustrates how Canada is going to get our economy back up and running and get back to some kind of fiscal order.
I take that point on the plan going forward, and that's what I asked the finance minister about. But I want to ask you a couple things about what you just said. First of all, this, you characterize the position Canada started in as weakened and vulnerable due to a $30 billion deficit. Even if that didn't exist, we'd still have a $313 billion deficit now. I can't find an economist anywhere who says Canada was the most vulnerable or very vulnerable at the start of this. In fact, they say we were in a pretty good fiscal position given the debt to GDP ratio. What's your response to that?
Well, I can get you lots of quotes that point to the other side of the story. And I can point to you the fact that when Canada was downgraded by Fitch, the credit rating agencies, the reason why was not the temporary response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It was the structural deficits that existed. In fact, that rating agency, when they downgraded Canada, pointed that there is a risk of another downgrade if there isn't some kind of return to fiscal order. And that's what I'd really like to make the point on. We have to separate out two different things. One, of course, is the response to the pandemic. No matter which party was in power, we would have had a response. We would have had help to Canadians to get through and weather the storm. We also would have had a decline in economic activity as provinces shut down many parts of the economy. What we're talking about now is when these restrictions lift, when these programs time lapse, when they sunset, we need to get back on some kind of a path back to fiscal management. That is what is missing here in this update today, was any sense that one day we might have to stop borrowing the billions of dollars worth of newly printed money from the Bank of Canada.
I do want to ask you about what the Conservatives would do alternatively when it comes to a recovery, but just on the way in which you're offering that context. First of all, the Fitch downgrading. My understanding is Germany and Canada were the only two G7 countries who actually had a AAA rating to begin with. I read through their downgrade. A lot of their worry about the future has to do actually with the provincial debt load. in this country. It also, Fitch said that it had confidence in Canada's economic recovery in 2021 because of the advanced, well-diversified and high-income nature of its national economy. It also cites Canada's political stability, strong governance and policies that have, quote, delivered steady growth and low inflation. Why I'm putting that to you, Mr. Scheer, is because the way in which you characterize the economy to begin with and the handling of it, of this government, is almost selectively choosing those facts, right? What Fitch is putting forward, but it's not the full picture.
No. I mean, I know that's the Liberal spin, but if you keep reading, Vashi, you'll see in that Fitch downgrade that there is further risks to downgrades because of the lack of any kind of a plan to get back to balanced budgets. There's no question. It's an observable fact that Canada has the worst unemployment rate of the G7. Before the pandemic hit, there was the conditions for a made in Canada recession. We saw tens of billions of dollars of foreign investment leave Canada, flee the country because of over-regulation and a higher tax burden. If we want to have a successful recovery, we cannot raise taxes and impose new regulations on our economy. Every country around the world will be desperately fighting to attract jobs and investment. Canada has to offer something. We have to have a competitive edge. And you're right, Fitch can point to things that have existed in Canada for decades. I don't think you're going to give Justin Trudeau credit for a stable political situation when he shut down Parliament and sidelined the opposition. We inherited that from generations of Canadians fighting to make sure that we have a stable political environment. When we're looking at the recovery, what is Canada going to do to get that investment here? Conservatives are calling to unleash the power of the free market, the private sector, by reducing taxes, reducing the regulatory burden, and giving investors around the world a reason to choose Canada to get our economy back up and running. All of that was missing today.
So if you are worried about the size of the deficit, the size of the debt, and you decrease taxes, I take the point on what that can trigger in a recession, but we also saw today a loss of, I think it was $105 billion in revenue. That will further add to those losses if you decrease taxes. How does that help the recovery?
Well, when you lower taxes, you attract investment that creates jobs, that helps get people back on their feet. At the very least, I think you might agree with me that the middle of a pandemic was not the time to raise taxes. The Trudeau Liberals went ahead with their planned increase on the carbon tax. I have a lot of farmers in my riding that had to pay for drying grain this harvest. That's going to increase their costs, going to increase a lot of costs for Canadians around the country. They increased payroll taxes, which makes it more expensive for businesses to pay their staff. It means less money in people's pockets at the end of the pay period. And they raise excise taxes. So at the very least, we shouldn't be raising taxes and making it harder to do business in Canada. And as you know, we're in the final stages of a leadership race. And I'm confident that the next Conservative leader will put forward a detailed recovery plan, but it will be predicated on recognizing that when you leave a dollar in the hands of the Canadian who earned it, it is always better for the economy than in the hands of the politician who taxed it. That's one thing the Liberals don't understand. They believe that the government knows best and can allocate resources better than free people making free decisions. That's a difference of philosophy that Canadians are going to have an opportunity to choose in the next election.
So I asked the Minister of Finance multiple times about taxes. He maintains, and the Prime Minister did today as well, that they have no plan to raise them right now. The Prime Minister also said he won't cut spending. Would a Conservative government cut spending to aid in the recovery while lowering taxes?
Well, we would certainly eliminate wasteful spending. The Liberals gave $35 billion to the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. They haven't completed a single project. It protects the investment of wealthy investors and puts all the risks on the backs of taxpayers. They sent $250 million to the Asian Infrastructure Bank, a development bank that helps extend the influence of the Chinese government in that region. They gave $50 million to MasterCard, $12 million to Loblaw. So there are lots of examples where the Canadian tax dollars going to well-connected, wealthy elites under this Liberal government. Conservatives want to leave that in the hands of Canadians. Let people do what people do best, which is create jobs and opportunities. That's what we're arguing for.
The examples you provided, though, let's say I add them up to $37 billion. The deficit, I was just asking Mr. Singh the same thing. The deficit is $343 billion. You know the narrative that is out there about Conservatives, that they're going to cut program spending if they get in power. Would a Conservative government do that?
Well, that is a liberal and media narrative that just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. It was the Liberal government in the 90s that slashed healthcare and other social services. I made a commitment during the last election campaign to fully fund the healthcare agreements with the provinces. We've identified clearly where we would eliminate wasteful spending. If you want more dollars to add to that tally, I can talk about the super clusters corporate welfare that gave out billions of dollars to private companies throughout the country, the foreign aid that has gone to countries that either don't need it or run by governments that certainly don't deserve it. There's lots of areas that we've identified, but the key focus is here. We have to recognize that much of this deficit should just be time limited. It should be linked to the pandemic response, and when that threat is over, then all of that spending will lapse. We'll then be faced with the challenge of lower economic activity. We need to stimulate that. We need to get that back up. We believe the best way to do that is through removing wasteful regulations and punishing taxes. Then we're going to have to take a look at the wasteful spending on the other side. So all of this to say is that it is doable. No one's suggesting that it's going to happen in the very short term. But what was missing today was any kind of a signal to Canadians, to the international investment community, to lenders who the government will need to borrow money from, that there's some kind of a plan to get back on fiscal track.
Before I let you go, Mr. Scheer, I heard you take a number of questions today, and you didn't like those questions. You rejected the premise of them about wearing a mask yesterday at Pearson. I know that your office had said that you weren't wearing the mask momentarily in conversation. I want to reframe the question and ask you, because what I have seen lately, and especially on social media, but even in person yesterday in Toronto, for example, are smaller protests or protests loudly on social media about the very idea of wearing a mask. And in fact, putting out that it's the government trying to control our lives. Very clearly, could you state whether you believe people should be wearing masks, whether that is their kind of duty, and should they be complying with the bylaws that are in existence right now?
Well, as you mentioned, I was wearing a mask the entire time I was on the flight, and from Regina to Toronto, and then again after I put it back on my way to Ottawa. Of course, I believe people should be following the advice that's coming out from health officers. Obviously, people should be following bylaws as well.
Do you reject that argument put forth that this is some concoction of the government to further control our lives?
Absolutely. I believe that when you've got medical experts that believe that this is the best way to control the spread of a virus that is having a major impact, we're losing loved ones, that people need to be doing everything that they can do to help mitigate that spread.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Scheer. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Vashi.
We decided to take on that debt to prevent Canadians from having to do it. If the federal government hadn't taken on significant debt in order to send money to Canadians to support businesses and households, what would Canadians have done? They would have loaded up their credit cards. They would have scrambled to try and find ways to pay their bills and pay their groceries and figure out how to care for their loved ones. We took on debt so Canadians wouldn't have to.
Today's fiscal statement revealed the impact of all that government spending in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the government, the projected deficit for this year is $343 billion. That's nearly 10 times higher than the government's forecast pre-pandemic. Of course, a big chunk of that, $212 billion, was spent in direct support to individuals and businesses struggling through the COVID-19 crisis. We just spoke to the finance minister, and we're going to get reaction throughout the show tonight from various political parties. Let's start with Jagmeet Singh. He's, of course, the leader of the NDP. He joins us from his office on Parliament Hill, I believe. Hi, Mr. Singh. Good to see you again.
Hi there, good to see you, Ms. Capelos.
The major proposal that I heard you put forward earlier today, and you have in the past as well, but specifically this morning, is that you want the government to adopt a wealth tax. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, the budget watchdog in this country, put forward an analysis of your proposal and said it would raise this year about $5.6 billion. We just outlined the deficit is $343 billion. The drop in revenue is about $105 billion. What you're proposing would only make a small dent, right?
Well, we're just proposing this as one measure, but really it's about the frame. What we often see from governments, whenever there's a difficult time, it's always working class people, families that are asked to bear the brunt of it, but the wealthiest are never asked to pay their fair share. So what we're proposing is a different frame. If the economic situation is dire, and we know it is difficult, that we have to make difficult choices. It shouldn't be the people that are most desperate that are asked to pay their share when they're already contributing so much and they're already so desperate. It should be those who are the wealthiest, those at the very top, who we ask to pay their fair share.
Who's asking anyone who isn't wealthy or anyone basically beyond that crowd to pay more? I'm curious because we just had the finance minister on and he was pretty explicit, at least at this point, he's not raising taxes for anyone.
Well, my concern is that given the fiscal snapshot that we just saw, we're going to start hearing a lot of pressure from the right, from conservatives saying we can't afford to help Canadians. We've already heard some of that coming out from different people who are saying that we've got to stop the CERB or stop helping people. And I just want to point out that that's always the case whenever there's a financial difficulty. It's always social programs that the conservatives want to cut. Liberals also have in the past cut the programs that people need, but instead I'm suggesting that we should ask the wealthiest to pay their fair share, those who have fortunes of over 20 million. What about some of the companies that we know that made massive profits during this pandemic? Amazon, Netflix, who pay effectively no taxes in Canada. What about the offshore tax havens, which is also something like $27 billion of wealth that's hidden purposely from Canada so that it's not contributed back into the economy? These are the things I think we need to address in the difficult times going forward.
I take your point on all of that, but again, when we stack up those ideas against the size of the deficit, and in no way am I saying, get rid of it right now, but you're talking about, let's say, a tax evasion worth $27 billion or $25 billion, I think is what the PBO initially said it was. The money that you would raise through the wealth tax is $5 billion, maybe increasing by 2028 to $10 billion. I mean, that is not substantial enough to get at what will eventually be a huge problem in this country, for example, if interest rates go up. What else would you propose the government do?
Well, what I'm saying is the approach can't be what we've seen in the past, where the choice is just, do we cut the services that people rely on and bring in austerity, or continue to let the wealthiest get away with not paying their fair share? I think that's just the wrong thing to do. And what we have to start with doing is changing that narrative and saying, you know what? The wealthiest should be the ones that contribute more. Those at the very top, the richest Canadians, those who are the 1%, those who have massive wealth, that's where we need to start. And then we need to go to the corporations that are the wealthiest corporations. That's the approach, I think, that makes the most sense. And after a crisis, investing in people is one of the best ways to stimulate the economy. To in any way stop doing that is only going to make the cost of this crisis even worse. And so I'm proposing a different approach. Let's, instead of putting the burden on working people, on families, and those that are struggling, let's ask those at the very, very top to pay their fair share.
Let me ask you, though, and maybe setting aside the wealth tax, you mentioned corporations. If you were to increase corporate taxes, for example, at this juncture, I mean, I understand the argument behind that in normal times, but they're already now letting go of lots of people. They're finding it difficult to bring, back on the wage, people back on the wage subsidy. Demand is really depressed, right? And so if you add a further burden to companies, to corporations, to even individuals in the form of taxes, won't that sort of slow down any potential recovery?
Well, what I'm proposing is we know that there's a lot of companies that are actually enjoying massive wealth and massive profits during this time. I gave the example of Amazon, of Netflix. There's lots of companies that are enjoying a significant profit in grocery stores that have seen an increase in profit. There are ways to make sure that those who are at the very top contribute fairly. I think we should also be very aware of small businesses, medium-sized businesses that are not in a position to do that. But there are certainly corporations that are able to contribute more. The pain should not be felt by working families. The pain should be the burden should be placed on those who are able to actually contribute more. We know that there's been a concentration of wealth into fewer and fewer hands. And so let's ask those at the very top who hide their money in offshore tax havens, who have all sorts of loopholes that allow them to avoid paying their fair share. Let's make sure that companies that aren't paying taxes in Canada pay those taxes in Canada. Those are some of the things that we need to look at instead of always putting the burden on families.
I just don't see where the government has said so far that they are going to put the burden on families. And I understand, again, what you're saying, but I do have to genuinely challenge the notion that if you raise $25 billion and recoup all the tax evasion money and you add $6 billion with the wealth tax, you're still left with a $313 billion deficit.
Well, we're in a lot better position than we would otherwise be. And it's a lot better for us to ask the wealthiest to start contributing more. And I think that's just a matter of fairness. And the fact that the government, for example, delayed on giving help to Canadians with disabilities, but then gave nearly $1 billion to their friends and we, the fact that the government was about to put someone who may have been on the border of applying for CERB, threatening to put them in jail, but allowing a company to get government support, even though they're cheating the system, to allow a company to take government support, even though they can use $1 million to give bonuses to their CEOs. That to me is a contrast. That to me is a problem with the government's approach. Liberal government has not taken an approach of asking the very wealthiest, their powerful, well-connected friends to contribute their fair share. That's been going on for far too long, and I'm saying that that has to stop.
Parliamentarians come back to the Hill in 2 weeks. Do you plan to predicate support for any legislation that the government should table on them adopting this wealth tax?
Well, I won't be putting out some of those negotiations right now. We'll be having negotiations directly with the government, but these are some of the things that we're calling on. These are priorities for me, and we'll move forward with negotiations. Right now, the top of mind is we're fighting hard to get help to Canadians with disabilities, and that's something that I've put out as something that we need to see. We need to see some action on, and we're going to continue to fight on that. But this wealth tax and asking the ultra-rich to pay their fair share is something that's also a priority for me.
So you just don't want to say publicly whether or not you're going to predicate your support on it?
We're not going to negotiate those details right now in this forum, but I can certainly let you know as soon as we put forward something that is a deal breaker. I've been very open with letting folks know what is and what isn't. Most recently, we said that we would not support the government unless they extended the CERB, and we were able to win and fight back and push the government to do something that we're not otherwise letting us know they were going to do.
Okay, I'll leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Singh, for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.